Welcome to the Praxis Behind the Obscure podcast. And today I have a very special guest joining me from over in Japan. And he is an author. He's also the head of the Neo-decadent art movement, which includes a lot of different types of writings and occult themes, and also a member of the Japanese O.T.O. So can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into esoteric and occult practices and writings and things along those lines?
Yeah, thanks. So, first of all, I just want to say thanks so much for having me on here. Um,
Mhm.
yeah, I mean, I guess I'll go straight into it. I would say I came out of I guess thinking about the background of anyone who gets like seriously into the occult or esoteric, and I think compared to a lot of people I know and a lot of people I've heard about, my background is I was raised in quite a like serious Roman Catholic background. I mean, I don't know I don't know about your own background, but
Mhm.
I was raised I was raised in that, and both my background's a little bit mixed. My father,
Were they like strict Catholics pretty much, or was it
um,
more of like they go to church on Christmas kind of Catholics?
yeah, they
you
were.
know?
I'm trying to think how to describe it because they were. I was thinking about how to describe this, and I wouldn't call them strict in the sense of that they were necessarily strict with me, but they took it seriously. So they were
Hmm.
like they definitely weren't Christmas and Easter uh Catholics, and
Hmm.
they were quite aware. Well, at least my father. I mean, he was quite aware of kind of like the scholastic tradition or the kind of more like intellectual side of it. So.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
but they definitely took it very seriously, and they still do today, right? Um so I was coming from an environment where I guess I was sort of like considering these um like ontological, or I guess you could call them existential kind of questions from quite a young age, and I guess I had a lot to think about with these with with this kind of like entire system which was being presented to me.
Hmm.
So I think I was thinking about that phrase like out of the box thinker. Um,
Hmm.
and I think if you really look into that phrase, I think the first part of it is like being aware that there is a box. You know what I mean?
Mm. Yeah,
Um,
sure, sure.
so I think like Roman Catholicism um, is a very complicated box if you know what I mean. Um,
Sure, sure, sure.
so it I think I reached the point where I reached the point before I think before I was even a teenager where I realized that it was a box, but again it's a very complicated box, and there's a lot of over the over the 2,000 years there's a lot of very complicated kind of thought that has gone into it.
Mm.
Being I guess being myself, I did take it even as a very small child. I took it very seriously, and I started thinking like, well, what is real? Like, is this real? Are supernatural things real in the same way
Mm.
a sandwich is real? Or so I started like when I was even a very small, I guess, child. I was sort of dealing with these existential or kind of almost like mystical questions, but again, being Catholicism, there was always a very complicated answer ready. So um,
Mm.
so I was grappling with that, and I took it very seriously until I was about maybe 11 or 12 or so, and
Mhm.
eventually the sort of I guess internal contradictions kind of just became too much, and what is probably the standard move, which is you just pivot the other way. So you pivot to just like atheism, right?
Mm. Yeah.
And I think a lot of people do that and still do that and kind of just continue that for life. So so I went from a pretty, thoughtful Catholic to probably a pretty thoughtful atheist. And
Mm-hmm.
and I kind of stayed that way for most of my teens. I mean, I was very invested in like the scientific method and this sort of this very like rational sort of perspective or
Mm-hmm.
approach to things. Um, but again, it wasn't like my temperament was always quite different. So
Mm-hmm.
um, as I was continuing with my reading, of things like Robert Anton Wilson or um, Grant Morrison or
Awesome. Yeah.
Dick or all these kinds of writers. Um, I started getting more of that sort of I guess we would almost call like a chaos magic perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
So those
so
writers kind of like open the doors to new ways of thinking and new
yeah,
ways
yeah,
of,
definitely as a teenager.
yeah.
So I
Mm-hmm.
say like from the time I was a teenager until really almost my mid 20s, I drifted into this sort of like chaos magic sort of perspective where I was doing very basic rituals and I was kind of taking that perspective on board.
Mm-hmm.
And that really persisted for most of my 20s. Um, and I think one thing which kind of pushed it over the edge was as I've seen discussed on some of the previous podcasts too, was the role of psychedelics in sort of
Yeah.
uh, just making that final kind of like final leap into magic or into really embracing the practice, I would say. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
so I think I mean I've heard someone else say that if you're getting seriously into psychedelics, you're sort of like halfway to the occult. Um, and
That's true. Yeah.
I think that's a good way of looking at it. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but again, my background was very my background was a pretty I guess I would say like a pretty, again, not really strict but pretty methodical or quite thought out Catholic background. But my present I would say like my present perspective is just completely almost the other extreme. I mean it's quite even like primitive kind of pagan. And
Right, right. I
and I
find that
also
interesting. Friends of mine who like their dad was a like a pastor or a priest or anything like that. They always went the other end of the spectrum. They always swung the pendulum to the fully opposite end, right? Like
yeah,
totally either like you said, like atheist, or like other friends that went full like yogi,
yeah,
like the opposite. I would just like
yeah,
totally piss off their parents, and
yeah,
like a
yeah, yeah,
completely like non-dogmatic, like just meditate in the woods.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's very interesting to see that.
I think the reasoning for that is because it is such a complicated box, and because it's such um like I have like ages 0 to like 10 for me were
Yeah.
enough Christianity for like 10 incarnations basically. So like so there's like no like it has no, I mean like I know it inside out, so there's nothing really um like I think people from like people who were raised in either kind of like in different backgrounds or sort of more I don't know how to say it, but well basically just any other background, like whether that's a a Buddhist background or even like a new age kind of background. I mean I think for them there's more of a sense that there might be like hidden depths to Christianity or Catholicism or something. And um I was I would like by the time I was about 12 years old, I was like I had, I'd been so deep in it that there's very little about it that could, I think at this point, that could like ever surprise or like really interest me that much. So I think one reason, like a lot of people probably just completely um, go the other way.
Yeah, that
So
makes sense.
I think the sort of psychedelic or chaos kind of perspective. I mean, I was pretty steeped in that up until I would say like my mid 20s, and I'd always been I'd always been interested in Thelema and Aleister Crowley, but other than reading a few very kind of foundational texts, like I hadn't really taken it on that much, and I just sort of like assumed in kind of a naive way that I think a lot of people do. Uh,
Hmm.
Most of the material had been sort of like superseded or just like integrated so well that there wasn't even really much point in looking at it in depth.
Mm.
Um,
Mm.
which I think is still kind of a perspective that a lot of people have. Um, but I just without really trying to, I just ended up reading more and more Crowley material and Crowley books, and I found out that I hadn't really actually understood it very well at all, and like actually that it was quite at odds with probably most people's, even most current occultists' values and maybe even kind of actual practice as well. Um,
Hmm.
so when I found myself in Japan, I mean, I know you're in Korea, and I'm just
Mm.
over the pond here in in Japan. Um,
You've been there for over 10 years, right?
yeah, over 10 years. So I guess kind of the same as you, right? You've been in Korea about a decade, or
Yeah, roughly about that. Yeah.
yeah. So I've been living here quite long term, and I was doing I'd formed sort of a kind of like a informal kind of magical group with some like-minded friends here. Uh,
Hmm.
we were really into psychedelics. We were really into kind of magic, and we're kind of all very chaos magic sort of influenced. So we're meeting pretty regularly, um, and kind of doing fairly basic, researching fairly basic stuff and doing kind of fairly basic practice. Um,
Hmm.
and at one point, me and myself and one of the other members we're just sitting around and we're like, I wonder if there's a Japanese O.T.O, right?
Mm.
Out there was. So we got in touch with them, and I at least eventually ended up joining. Um, so as a result of that, I mean, I just got even more into Thelema, which is sort of continuing to the present.
Hmm. The Japanese OTO, I'm curious, like when did that lodge start? Like, does it have like did it start like a long time ago, or is it more of like a modern thing?
Yeah,
Like,
it's if I remember correctly, this year it's exactly 30 years old.
okay, it's been around a while.
So yeah, it actually has been around a while, and there are some interesting links. Like there's some members who would be well known to I guess American or European branches or lodges
Hmm.
have actually been out to Japan and have spent some time here. Um, but it is, again, being that it is Japan based, Japan centered, and Japanese membership, it definitely has its own unique sort of perspective. And I think that's the other thing that interests me. I mean, there's again, and I think a common perspective is that hierarchical magical orders are sort of like old Eon, or uh,
Yeah, right.
especially now, and like that was definitely my perspective too. From my
Mm.
20s, I was just thinking, oh, this must be outdated, or everything, you can do everything as a solo practitioner.
Hmm.
Now that we have the internet, we can just do everything ourselves. We don't need to. Why would you join a hierarchical, order that's been around and is easily
Hmm.
global, and you can find all the flaws before you even start, right? Um, and I think that's, like, to be fair, I think that is a very valid perspective, and I would actually be suspicious of anyone who didn't go in with that perspective. Um,
Mm.
so I think everything should be open to a lot of criticism right from the start. But for me, at least, I mean, I think, especially because it is Japan centered and Japan based. There's sort of almost like an interesting fusion of, I would say, like thelema and some maybe Japanese influences or Eastern influences.
That sounds pretty cool. Pretty eclectic, right?
Yeah, it's very eclectic, and especially with some things like sort of finding links between Western astrology and like Chinese astrology.
Oh,
Um,
that sounds really cool. Wow.
yeah, so there's definitely some members working on. Um, I won't talk about their projects too much, but
Hmm.
members who are really pioneering kind of like a synthesis of what I would consider Western esotericism and sort of the Eastern esotericism as well. Um,
That's interesting because I don't know that much about it, but here in Korea, there's something called Saju, which is sort of it's based on like Chinese astrology, but
right,
they
right,
also
right, right.
they use a natal chart, and there's different elemental correspondences and stuff like that. So I definitely want to interview. I'm gonna try to get like one of these people on here that speaks English on one of the episodes because I think it'd be super interesting because they have um, some, I guess some of them do understand Western astrology too. So
Yeah,
uh,
yeah,
I
yeah,
yeah, I
yeah.
think it's
If you'd
something that's not like Western people, or a lot of Western practitioners don't, they know about it, but they haven't really heard much about it or haven't really dived into it. So it'd be pretty interesting to hear that perspective. And like you're saying, you have people who are like synthesizing them. That's pretty interesting, I think.
Yeah, I'd love to. I might pitch the idea to them. I'd actually love to get one of the Japanese members on here for an interview where they could
Oh,
maybe
that'd be sick.
they'd maybe even talk about their own practice because as
Hmm.
you said, I think the general idea in the West of like Chinese astrology is very it's almost like it's just like it's like almost like a stereotypical Chinese restaurant idea. It's like, are you the rat or are you the ox? Or
Yeah,
um
that's what I was thinking. Yeah, fortune
so I
cookies, right? Yeah.
so I think a lot of people don't perceive that it actually is an equally deep system with with similar sort of I don't know what you would call them, I guess esoteric extrapolations or applications, you could say. Um,
Yeah, exactly. Hmm.
so I think that's one reason where I would say, and I think another reason I decided to really join um, was because I think I did want to just get this sort of almost like community where I, I think when you're like I enjoy this with I enjoy collaborating with people on like artistic projects as well. Um,
Hmm.
so I thought, well, I'm already doing my solo practice, so um, why not? And I was thinking, well, I want to the extent that I'm able to, I want to meet Thelemites in Japan, and certainly certainly joining the O.T.O would be a good way about that, right? Um,
Right. So it's good to also expand your social network and work on certain projects and stuff like that. And as far as like there's like group ritual work and stuff like that, what would you say is like we're talking about like practicing solo versus group? What benefits have you seen from like the group practices versus, you know, going completely solo?
well, I think it was maybe Frater RC in one of your previous podcasts, and I think he commented on this issue, and he said something like, even when you're with a group or with an order, you're still alone. And I think there's a lot of truth to that idea where your solo practice is continuing alongside your group practice.
Mm-hmm.
And to an extent, your group practice is almost like an extension of your solo practice. So it's not like you're giving up any individuality or any of your solo practice. And even when you're doing group work or group practice, you're very much bringing your solo practice to bear upon that. And
Mm-hmm.
but I think the benefit is you do get other people's perspectives and you see what other people are. So you're coming to something with people from very different backgrounds, different races, different genders, entirely
Mm-hmm.
cultural backgrounds or histories, who might be working on things that you're not so good at or you want to explore further. I'm personally at astrology is one of my sort of weak points, and some of the like I mentioned, some of the Japanese members here are just like astrology geniuses. So anything I can take away and learn from them and sort of get value from is definitely great for me. So yeah, I mean, I think I don't know if I'm like preaching to the crowd here, but I definitely don't think anyone should be like intimidated by group practice or like should assume that magical orders are like outdated or old aeon or
Mm-hmm.
anything like that. So I think you have to investigate and definitely come in with a critical approach. But
Sure.
I think there's a lot of value you can get from it, and a lot you can learn from it.
For sure. And also seems like it's very much so lodge by lodge kind of thing, right? Like you hear some horror stories of certain groups, right? And then
Yeah,
other ones that are like very well put together and have, incredible members that are writing amazing books and kind of pushing the envelope in different areas of study.
yeah.
And whatnot, right?
I personally don't. I mean, it might sound kind of boring, but I personally don't have like any horror stories or any I guess I don't know what you would call it, like malicious gossip or sort of negativity about it. I mean, I notice online there is a lot of it's very political, it's very factional, and
Mm,
it does seem to be very case by case basis. But
mhm,
it's out in Japan, I mean, I guess we're sort of on our own literal island here.
mhm.
Yeah, I have the Japanese O.T.O, Nihil Lodge. I have nothing but good things to say about them. So,
Mhm.
but definitely,
That's based.
I would advise
That's
anyone to definitely do your homework and come in with
mm,
a critical perspective and have standards. And as long as you do that, I mean, I think you should be fine.
okay, cool. Yeah, if someone's in Japan, how would they find it? You can how would they look
I
it
was
up?
just it does have a website in both English and Japanese. Um,
Hmm.
So you just log up, Google up Nihil Lodge, which is the name of the local O.T.O body,
Hmm.
and should be able to get in contact through that.
Okay, cool.
I was wondering,
Um,
do you know if is there a Korean O.T.O, or are there many orders like active in Seoul or in Korea?
as far as I know, there isn't. I've looked stuff up like that before. There
Yeah,
isn't. There are a few Freemason lodges, and I'm pretty close with some of the guys at the one of the main lodge here, actually in Seoul,
right.
and which is pretty cool. It's not. I mean, it's not the OTO, but there are some guys that are more into the esoteric stuff, and then
Yeah,
some
I've had
guys that just like to hang out and drink all night, which is also fun too. So.
yeah, I've met some people with Masonic backgrounds here, and
Mhm, mhm,
I think it's definitely a different perspective, but the O.T.O is, I guess, what you would call like a pseudo Masonic order. So there's definitely a chassis or a kind of a foundation of. There's definitely like Masonic literal DNA with it. In the way
right.
with
There's like degrees and whatnot, right?
yeah. I mean, it is a mystery school. It's an initiatory order. And I think that brings us back to your question, which is, yeah, I mean, can you completely initiate yourself? Well, sure. I mean, I'm sure you can, but yeah, going through initiations in that sense is at least for me, I found to be a very valuable experience. And I always think, what would initiations in an occult order, what would you really compare the experience to psychically? And I always do come back to comparing it to doing psychedelics, because always, like, you, to a certain extent, you know what's going to happen, but you always kind of don't at the same time. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think mentally putting yourself in that space of at least some complete uncertainty.
Sure, putting yourself in a sort of vulnerable space.
Yeah, exactly. And
you can
I think
experience things. Yeah.
So I think reaching that initiatory, kind of vulnerable or uncertain mental state, I think that's an area common to esoteric practice and psychedelics and initiatory or kind of mystery school type orders. Because I think that initiatory mindset or initiatory is when you're actually most aware of reality in a way, because the sort of psychic sensor or the filter kind of, you don't have that to fall back on as much.
Okay.
So
yeah.
Can you reach that same initiatory mindset by yourself? Well, yeah, certainly you could. But I do think there is value in undergoing initiations in kind of like a formal context or
right. And it's not like the two are mutually exclusive. Like, it's not like you can't do your own work, when you're on
definitely
your own.
Yeah. So that's that's definitely my
almost
perspective.
like sometimes the way people describe it's almost like this false dichotomy of like,
yeah,
you can't do your own.
I find it a very strange dichotomy where some people react so strongly against the idea of like joining anything, like, and I get that. I guess I would classify this as sort of like a instinctive American perspective, which you could apply kind of across the board to other fields of pursuit. But I think there's this naive perspective that in practice often ends up being everyone assumes that they're the absolute individual. It's almost like let's see how individual we can all become in exactly the same way.
Yeah, like it sounds like you're explaining a hipster, really.
Yeah, it is. I think there is this sort of line of thinking in a lot of among occultism, or and I think so. I think it doesn't have to be an either or proposition. I mean, your solo practice is the heart of the work. Basically, you have to do the work yourself, but you can always work with other people and learn and get value from that too. So I guess I would caution people to be absolutely opposed to any kind of idea of joining something or any kind of hierarchical order or something. So yeah, that's
Right.
sort of how.
So kind of keeping like a skeptical yet open to experience.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that is sort of, what I would consider the thelemic perspective, or at least it should be. Hesitant when people, the ways in which people would describe thelema. They would say, there's some people who take a very, like, they want like a replacement church almost.
You're right.
And I always think it's a very, to me, that seems a very strange way of looking at it. And there's other people who want it to be, just anything they want it to be. If they're basically like I don't know, secular liberal humanist, perspective, then that's what they want it to be. And they'll, there's people that want it to be, or people who want magic to be entirely, kind of psychological phenomenon, or fit within their kind of framework. So I'm always, and I think Crowley himself was quite skeptical of any attempt to have these kind of definite locked in place perspectives on it. And if you know,
right.
if you look at the way he taught people, he often did give contradictory answers to things. Like he would say, someone would ask him, is the Algoides, or the HGA, is it a supernatural entity, or is it just like a psychological construct,
higher genius or something?
Yeah. And I think depending on who he was talking to, or depending on the needs of the moment, he would give totally different answers. So I think a lot of the time, a lot of these questions do end up being sort of both and neither. I would certainly, but I definitely think a skeptical or a critical mindset is pretty crucial to any thelemic perspective, at least as I understand it. I mean, I wouldn't call myself any kind of master occultist or anything. I always do try to keep a beginner mindset and kind of a critical mindset, but that
an open mind that you can sort of take on different paradigms and whatnot.
Right. And
right, it's kind of funny because I see so much of this arguing online, like when you go on like Facebook or whatever, like psychological model versus spirit model, and like these people that people love to argue, and like
I think a lot of that is a remnant of Christian thinking, and specifically what I would consider Christian metaphysical thinking. And again, coming from I guess a pretty serious, Roman Catholic background, like I think I can recognize that, whereas I think some people don't know the I guess, like as Nietzsche would put it, like the genealogy of their own morals or their values, or their the genealogy of their metaphysics that they maybe take for granted without really interrogating or really investigating. And I think that I think one of the things that I came to terms with when I did sort of make my own break from Christianity was also sort of making a break from what I would consider, or I guess what you could call sort of a binary metaphysics of, like a material world and a spiritual world, or a natural world and a supernatural world. And I think a lot of people still, unconsciously incorporate this kind of metaphysic or this kind of dynamic, even once they, would consider themselves to have moved beyond it. But they're still sort of, maybe without realizing it, still sort of incorporating this, is it a metaphor? Is it like, is it psychological? And so I think a big part of my approach is sort of well, first trying to interrogate that and find out how deep that runs. See if there's anything we can do about it, because I actually kind of instinctively really dislike that sort of framing.
Sure. Me too.
I think in practice it doesn't really lead anywhere I would consider productive. Again, as we can see from controversy and a lot of this sort of low level of a lot of these debates. I think a lot of do degenerate into arguing about very kind of unexamined metaphysics, which lie beyond a lot of people's assumptions about what perspective they're coming from.
Sure, that makes complete sense. Okay, cool. What types of practices do you do regularly? I suppose, I suppose as a solo practitioner,
yeah, solo,
appropriate to explore. Yeah.
My solo practices are quite basic and are quite, like LBRP, Resh, basic sort of thelemic practices, the yogic practices. So I'm very, my daily rituals are very basic in that sense. And I think I'm gradually working my way into more Enochian territory, which I believe you've explored as well. So,
oh, sorry. Hold on one second. Okay. Yeah, my audio cut out for a second. Okay.
Oh, no worries. Yeah. Is it working or?
Oh, it's yeah. Hold on. Okay. Yeah, we're good. Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah, I think it's because you mentioned Enochian, so a portal sort of a.
yeah. And
I think you just opened one of the aethers, and my audio got sucked into
it. Yeah, it's definitely, I haven't pursued it as deeply until now as I would like to, but it's one of the areas I can see myself moving into more, and it's such a fantastically complicated but also weirdly elegant kind of system, I think.
Yeah, it's very complex, but at the same time simple. So I don't know, the only way I can describe it is there's a lot you do need to understand and study and create, right? Like
yeah.
I mean, creating like the furniture, table furniture and things, sigillum de and things like that. And then understanding sort of the why or the how, that kind of thing, right? Can take a while, but then in actual practice, it's not that complicated, right? So
right. And
the preparatory part is the complicated part, not the actual.
Yeah. So it seems a lot. Yeah, it does seem a lot of upfront work. It is something I'm planning to get to in the not so distant future. But as far as my daily practice goes, I mean, it is a lot of like pathworking, tarot, sort of like basic thelemic practices, Resh, LBRP. So I think my mindset can get quite imaginative and quite thinking into corners or thinking outside of the boxes. So I think I kind of conversely, I usually like to try to focus on the very kind of like basic rituals and just try to go ever deeper into them and see where they take me and see what I can get from them.
More kind of the presence of direct experience and exploring different deepening the same practices. It's very interesting. Have you ever read this not that long ago? It's Israel Regardie book called Ceremonial Magic, actually. Have you read that book?
No, I don't think I've read that particular one, but I have read a number of his other books, and
it's really a really good one. I think you should check it out sometime because it's short. It's only like 100. It's probably like 100 pages or something like that.
Right.
But he basically expands on it's only 2 rituals, which were the bornless one or the headless, right? And the watchtower, the Enochian watchtower.
Right.
So So he shows like the real simple outline of a ritual, and then he shows how over time you can just expand it and expand it. It's the same thing you're doing, but you're just deepening it and deepening
Right,
it
right,
and
right, right.
deepening it.
I think that
So
I think
it's quite interesting. Yeah.
I think that bornless ritual, or that headless ritual, or however it's translated, that's I was talking to one of my friends and collaborators, Damian Murphy, who's I'm never sure if I'm getting this right, but I think he's the head of the GD, the Golden Dawn in Seattle. But
Okay, cool.
he seems quite into that, the bornless one or the headless one, and especially tracing it to more accurate translations from like the Greek magical papyri. And
Right, the PGM's trending.
right.
It's trending heavily these days. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It does seem to be really blowing up. And
Yeah.
I think with like Jake Stratton Kent and some of the some other people who have, I actually vibe quite well with that approach of really looking at some of these apparently basic things in almost like their original context, rather than a sort of filtered, Victorian context.
Right. Sort of going back into the origins of a lot of the grimoire, like where did a lot of these grimoire start, and then how they evolved into like the GD or Thelema, right? And people are kind of like trying to go back to more sort of the origins of a lot of these things, right?
Right, and I think a lot of it is sort of is applying that, almost what I guess what a lot of people would consider a sort of like well, not really primitive, but
it's kind of funny because primitive to me sounds like cool, but then to others it could be like, oh, this is like stupid or something like that.
Right.
There's different ways you can interpret that word, I suppose, right?
I think I guess a bit, yeah, like a better way of putting it rather than primitive would be like original context, in a sense, because even the Golden Dawn in a lot of ways is very what I would consider sort of like Victorian Masonry, or sort of Victorian Christianized approach to a lot of these ideas.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because, like you're saying, people are going back towards I guess you would say primitive or older practices and origins, which I think is pretty cool to explore the different ways that people thought back then and their sort of praxis or the paradigms, right? And kind of seeing how things evolved. But
yeah.
And which is cool, but then at the same time there's almost like you fall into, with anything, these like false dichotomies or these like arguments again, right?
Well, those are, that's I think that is
it always cracks me up though, like how people love to argue these things, but it's like older is better, or no, newer is better, they fall into this,
and I think I guess like I don't really see them as being a progression so much as almost like competing metaphysical models in a way. And I think even with my own interest in Thelema is, to what extent is this actually a new aeon of not only values but also sort of these considerations where rather than having these either or sort of dichotomies between material and spiritual or psychological, or to what extent can we look at esotericism or occultism as actually interrogating very very basic sort of ontological positions, which I think a lot of people still sort of take for granted. And I think that is what interests me about the work of Jake Stratton Kent, where I think he even said something like he considers spirits to be material, which I think is a statement which a lot of people would just not even be able to process, right? Because
right, it sounds like a contradiction.
Yes, it sounds like a contradiction, and I think that's usually a sign that you've sort of reached the limits of the ontology that you're using, or the metaphysic that you're coming in with, when things start sounding like contradictions or turning into contradictions. I think it's usually a
Sure.
sort of you're sort of, you know, reaching the edge of the box, as it were.
Yeah, yeah, I think linguistics or words are a problem too, because like the most profound experiences I've had on, you know, heroic doses of psilocybin or LSD or like scrying the aethers, which have oddly enough been quite similar with these heroic dose experiences, right? Where you, I mean, I can try to write it down or I can
Yeah,
try to explain it. Maybe I'm dumb or maybe just vocabulary is not, is too limited in general. But
right,
there's this sort of, it's like you're trying to use these, it's like you're trying to use these symbols to explain these experiment, you know, it's like you're having this fourth dimensional experience but you're
right,
using 2D or 3D technology to explain it, and so it's not, it's sort of you can't really encapsulate it, so that's why it can appear
right.
very contradictory
Yeah,
or
and
hard to understand or something. Yeah.
right, and that it's interesting that you mentioned that because that is sort of one of my own areas of interest as well. Is how does like all of this intersect with language? Because um, I think if you are considering things like, you know, high dose psilocybin or
Hmm.
you know, some of the more well, I guess high dose DMT kind of experiences.
Hmm.
Um, I think there's a tendency to, I think a lot of people approach them almost as like this is completely beyond language. I mean, it just defeats language, or
Hmm.
um, it's so like there's no way to describe it, and certainly that certainly is what it what it feels like, right? Um,
Sure. Sure.
so, and I think even for myself, a big part of trying to come to terms with it, and you know, as I continue to do, you know, continue to go into, you know, go deeper into, you know, psilocybin and DMT and some of these realms, some of these areas is well, like where does this, at what point does this intersect with language? Um,
Mm.
and I think it can intersect in more productive ways than people would often assume. And I think,
Hmm.
but I think part of the challenge is sort of not giving into that temptation to just be like, it's indescribable, or like, you know, it's beyond language.
Sure.
And
Uh, Well, I think, like I said, I think I kind of mentioned that maybe I'm just too dumb to describe it. I'm not as, I'm not a master of words like you, like somebody who's like a writer like you, who
I,
who can better describe it. I can
I
describe it in very primitive ways, perhaps. You
well,
know,
but
but
I think I don't think there's any difference. I mean, you know, to
yeah,
you know, at an underlying level, I mean,
mm,
every way of describing it is necessarily going to be kind of primitive, right? I mean,
mm,
you know, and the more you could you really describe like what a cheese sandwich tastes like, or like what, you know, what getting punched in the head feels like? I mean, you can. I think even describing very basic things, the deeper you go into it, it becomes much more difficult and much more sort of tautological
mm,
than people would think. So I think
mm,
I think my way of looking at it, at least recently, is everyday things are actually much harder to describe than we would think, and you know,
yeah, that makes sense. Hmm.
extreme sort of mystical states or entheogenic states are maybe not necessarily easier to describe, but I think if we sort of resist the temptation to just be like it's beyond language, well, I wouldn't say it's really necessarily beyond language, but
Mm,
does sort of entail using language in ways that um, most people probably wouldn't, unless they're maybe like poets or have some sort of background with that. So
Sure, sure. It gets a
I
lot
feel like
trickier,
I feel like I've
you know?
maybe wandered off track here, but I guess the original point was always how much of that can you bring back, which is always the key consideration, at least for me.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I almost viewed, I remember having like deep psychedelic trips and like, you have this like direct experience of whatever you want to call it, different realities or entities or God or whatever, right? And I remember thinking like, this is what Moses or like these prophets are saying, and then they bring it back and then they codify it, and then people are believing other people's direct revelatory experiences rather than having their own. Does that make sense?
Right, right,
Like
right.
it's
And
like
you
it's like
always
it's like yeah, it's like I just ate a bunch of shrooms and then I wrote a book on what I saw, and then people thought that's like the ultimate reality of, although it was my experience, not their own,
right, right, right. And
revelation.
I think that's the
Yeah.
danger is when you I mean, it gets a bit technical, but I think it gets into that idea of representation where, like,
Mhm.
you could look at it as like the microcosm and the macrocosm. Like, to what extent can our language even um, refer to things, or like to what extent can it? Um, and for me, I mean, like the ideal obviously is the raw reality of sort of the you know, grabbing a fish from the water and just throwing it onto land, sort of immediate encounter with with these states. But
Mm.
but at the same time, I don't think the linguistic or sort of the language approach is necessarily a bad thing, and it can actually intersect with the direct experience as well in sort of interesting ways. And all of my all of my sort of psychedelic experiences, and also kind of focused esoteric experiences, you end up bringing back so much sort of language related content and things things which give me ideas for the ways these things sort of intersect or interact. So I don't see them as being completely separate, or I don't actually, sort of the microcosm is within the macrocosm, and the macrocosm is within the microcosm. And I don't know which one would even be which in this case, but I do think that language is real, and I don't think it's I think it's real in the same way that our bodies are real, which is maybe a weird way to put it, but
Mm.
I do think that language, it sounds a bit like Jake Stratton Kent with the spirits, but I do
Mm.
think that language is material in a strange way, and I do think that it does exist. Like, it's not just some convenient illusion or sketch or something. I mean, it is its own reality that exists alongside of and inside of other realities, and sort of produces and is produced by them, I guess you could say.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Speaking of Jake Stratton Kent, someday you have to read this book. I'd be curious what you think about it. He has a book called The Serpent Tongue, and it's on English Kabbalah, and how like words in the English, like a lot of the Kabbalah is like the Hebrew and
Right,
like
right, right,
different
right, right.
what's the term, like gematria, or
Gematria,
like
yeah.
yeah, yeah, like the numerical value of
Right.
certain words that are in certain texts and whatnot, right? So he does that with the English language, and so that book's a mind bender. You should definitely read that.
That sounds amazing. Yeah, I've been slowly working my way through Geo Sophia recently.
Oh,
Um,
that's a great one. Yeah, yeah.
so yeah, so yeah, the one you mentioned is definitely, I definitely like to get to that
Hmm.
soon.
All right, cool. Yeah. I'm curious, like, since you're in Japan and Japan has its own unique traditions and religions, Shintoism, and they have, like Zen is very popular there, like Zen Buddhism, which obviously Buddhism isn't from Japan, but sort of the Zen branch is definitely prominent there. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So there's like, and then there's the native stuff like Shinto and other things like that. What are some like interesting practices or traditions maybe that you've explored or that you've come into contact there that like a lot of Westerners might not be aware of?
Yeah, that's such a deep question, and
Mm.
uh, I almost don't know where to begin with, but I guess just to start with the beginning would be even with all of the branches and practices that you mentioned. I think to what extent is something like Zen or Chan Buddhism, like what to what extent is it even something that we would consider Buddhism, at least in its original context? And
Mm.
someone, I think, there's always a lot of ways to frame these things. I saw someone posted something where they described the original Buddhism as Vedic Satanism or something, which is
Okay,
such
yeah,
a
like a Vedic heretic or something like
yeah,
that, right?
it's such a strange way to describe it, but I think there's actually a lot of like accuracy there in a way. Um,
Hmm.
so I think Japanese Buddhism, which to a large extent is quite similar to the kind of Chinese Chan Buddhism, or
Yeah,
um,
I think that's where the origin lies, I believe. It's
yeah, and
yeah, uh-huh.
I'm always kind of like I always like to think, well, how much of this is like what we would consider like the equivalent of like Vedic Satanism, or like even I don't know what you'd call it, like Buddhist Satanism, or turning it on its head or something. And I think I think maybe the answer is just again another one of these kind of it's in dialogue with it or something, sort of kind of responses.
Hmm.
I have been down to Engakuji, which is one of the Zen temples here, and I do know I do have very close friends who have spent significant periods of time sitting down at the temple in Gakuji, and pursuing zazen and pursuing Zen very seriously. And
Mm.
I I'm also, I guess I did get very heavily into it for a while, and I'm quite into a lot of the Zen writings like Mumonkan, or the it's another one of these sort of untranslatable book titles, but I think it's usually translated as the Gateless Gate, or the Gateless Barrier. Um,
Mm, okay.
but it's just such a radical sort of collection of these Zen stories and Zen sayings. If you read it from a different angle, it'd almost be like absurdist fiction or something, because it's heavily absurd, and it's very funny, which is really strange. Like I think most religious texts are not usually known for their humor, right?
Right, right, right. That's what I like about some like definitely some Zen writings are like that, or like Chogyam Trungpa, like Tibetan
Right,
Buddhist
right,
writer, right?
right,
If you
and
ever read any of his books,
yeah,
it's like they're intentionally fucking with your head so that
right,
you get
and
on these like false dichotomies and stuff, right?
right, and I think one of the reasons that I did end up going deeper and deeper into Crowley and Thelema was that I started finding Crowley, and I still do find him just hilarious. Like there's like I crack up constantly when reading his descriptions of people, and especially anytime he like doesn't like someone or doesn't like something,
Mhm.
just destroys them basically with language. Um, and I think he was consciously throwing in a lot of jokes, a lot of humor. So I think the impulse to include humor, um,
Right.
just almost like compulsively, is sort of one that I recognize, and I'm always
Right. I
suspicious
de-
when when something doesn't do that. Like if something doesn't include more or less consistent sort of humor, like I wouldn't say I discount it, but I'm sort of like really, like, because I I mean, everything is just existence is just so inherently kind of ridiculous, or like it seems that way to me. Um,
Hmm. You have to
so
keep a sense of
anything which
humor along the way. Yeah.
yeah, and anything which sort of doesn't include that perspective seems a bit, again, not necessarily suspicious, but it
Hmm.
doesn't attract me so much as something which does, right? Um,
Right.
but that's I've wandered off topic again here. Um,
Hmm.
okay, so Japanese indigenous Japanese uh, esotericism. Well, there's
Hmm.
certainly is that Shan Buddhist or Zen Buddhist tradition, which is by this point is woven very deeply into the culture in interesting ways.
Hmm.
Um, as with everything Japan, a lot of material was imported from China, which I guess this would be the same with Korea too, right? I mean, there would be
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Definitely so Buddhism is pretty popular here as well. And yeah, it all came originally through pretty much a lot of the Buddhist stuff. It came through obviously India, Nepal, China, then to Korea, then to Japan. Kind of took that route.
yeah.
So they kind of change it, at each country it arrives at with different practitioners and cultures. It obviously transformed, right?
Right, and so there's Buddhism, and then the other main element I think is, as you mentioned, is Shinto in Japan, and
Hmm.
I think there's another thing that which sort of I wouldn't say really like boggles people, but it can be a difficult thing to get a grasp on because I think a lot of people come to it in terms of their existing sort of well, like rubrics or perspectives. Uh,
Mm.
and I think the basic question is that people try to get to grips with it is just like, well, what is it? What is Shinto? Like, is it a religion? Like you get you
Right.
get the you get these very earnest people, maybe asking Japanese people like, is Shinto a religion? And I think most of them would say like, well, no, right? Because it's not even. I don't think it's something they would even really necessarily conceive in those terms. And I think the even like in the history when you had state Shinto, like in the
Hmm.
1930s and kind of the World War II period, I think even that was sort of like a very self-conscious sort of like modern attempt to update it to religion status, or to sort of conform to maybe like an international sense of what that term means. So um
Hmm.
so
Sort
is
of like an ingrained part of the culture in ways, right? Isn't
yeah,
it
so
like yeah.
is Shinto a religion? Well, I like it's your perspective is as good as mine, but I wouldn't personally consider it like wouldn't even really conceptualize it in those terms. I mean, is it pagan? Is it animist? Well,
Mhm.
I mean, you could describe it that way, but I think it's just very much its own very specific, very kind of Japanese approach to these things. And does it have its own occult or esoteric dimension? Well, yeah, it certainly does. But it's not something I fully feel qualified to comment on too much. But I will
Mhm.
mention another branch which might be unfamiliar to people listening. Well, depending on who they are. But there's a branch called Onmyodo, which is uh, which is sort of like a traditional uh, esoteric, well, cosmology, or sort of a branch of practice, and it's essentially, I guess, we would consider divination, or again, based on a lot of it is coming from sort of Chinese Chinese sources, but there's a lot of native sort of content as well. Um, it was actually originally a branch of like the civil service that
Hmm.
included kind of like court divination functions and astrology functions or exorcism functions or things that things which we would now consider sort of esoteric functions. So that's on myodo, or the practitioners are called on myoji. Um,
Hmm.
there's sort of a that's sort of a very distinctly Japanese sort of branch of esotericism, which is maybe quite obscure at the moment. And I'm sure there are people who are familiar with it, and as with everything Japanese now, it sometimes comes up in like anime or manga or sort of like films and stuff. So
Right.
there is an element of that, but that's onmyodo is what I would sort of consider the traditional sort of divination or maybe a mysticism sort of branch of Japanese workings. And I've discussed it with some of the Japanese occultists that I know, and they usually say, yeah, it is roughly comparable or comparable to sort of those traditions. There's elements of sort of Taoist or sort of Buddhist elements in it as well.
Hmm. That sounds pretty interesting. Yeah, I haven't heard of that before, so that definitely sounds
Yeah,
interesting.
it's
I think,
interesting. I mean, it's probably
yeah.
it is one of the it doesn't really get as much play as sort of the Zen or sort of even sort of like Shinto kind of ideas, but um,
Hmm.
it does from what I've I'm far from being an expert on it, but at least to the extent that I understand it, and at least to the extent that I've looked into it, it does seem very technical, in the sense that in the sort of like occult sense of things being, kind of technical, like whether that's
Hmm.
Kabbalah or whether that's really any kind of technical occult system that you could look at. It does seem
Hmm.
very clear protocols and procedures that the practitioners would follow, or the onmyoji would follow. So
Hmm.
um,
Sounds interesting.
it is something I'd love to get to in more depth, and kind of in more depth in the future.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm definitely curious in exploring these sort of like I mentioned, Korea has that Saju system that we were talking about earlier, and then
I
Japan.
wonder if that would be. I wonder if that would sort of be even the equivalent of onmyodo. Like, I wonder if there's some
Mhm.
maybe something to look up afterwards. To what extent that's sort of a um, similar practices, or I mean, I wouldn't
Mhm.
be surprised if there was some crossover there.
Oh, for sure. Definitely, it'd be interesting to bring it to a wider audience, since most, people in the West or Europe and America are definitely haven't even heard of these things or not aware of these sort of native practices in
Yeah,
East
it's
Asia.
very they are very obscure still now. I mean, I think some of the
Mhm.
the Eastern systems are always they're always like in vogue, but often
Yeah.
usually in a very superficial or kind of appropriated way, right?
Oh, do you have a Zen garden in your house?
Yeah, yeah. So it's usually on that very or even like something like the theosophy kind of ideas of like Hinduism and stuff. So um,
Right, right,
I think there is
right.
this. I think there is this sense where it can come off in a Western context in a very superficial or sort of like appropriative context. And even a lot of people are even surprised, like even that there is like a Japanese O.T.O. Like what? There's non-Western Thelemites. Like is that even real, right?
Right, right,
Um,
right.
and what? They're not they're not doing it in English, or they're doing it in Japanese, or doing a Gnostic mass in Japanese, or what? Like is that even a thing, right? So um,
Sure.
I think there is that sense in which probably a good percentage of the occult world just isn't even aware of it. So um,
Hmm.
yeah, so I guess if anyone could get anything from, hopefully from this conversation or this podcast, yeah, maybe looking into On-myodo or this kind of these kind of systems would be kind of a productive area of study or something something to look at.
Okay, for sure, for sure. Yeah, I just recently picked up one of your books on Amazon Kindle.
Right.
Welcome to the Arms Race. I haven't cracked into it yet. I just recently got it, but
Okay. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I'm curious. Maybe we can chat a little bit about your writing, and you know. So you mentioned that you're part of this art movement as well, right? Called Neo-decadence. And
Right. Right.
so
Right.
yeah, maybe you can let us know a little bit about what that is and
Right.
what kind of
Yes,
themes are
I'm
at the
always
core.
hesitant to clarify this. So I'm not actually the founder of Neo-Decadence. That's the founder, the creator is his name is Brendan Connell, and he was he wrote the first well he at the time he just called it Manifesto of Neo-Decadence. Again, this is in the sense of you know, writing artistic manifestos, which you know, sort of has a tradition behind it at this point with surrealism and futurism and a lot of these other earlier artistic movements which were fairly, you know, unified or coherent. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but I have been working with it, you know, in recent years pretty consistently, and I've either edited or co-edited, uh, let's see, about four anthologies at this point of neo-decadent writing
Mm-hmm.
and manifestos of people tackling various topics. Um, so just to give some of the background, I think hopefully without getting too technical, because I don't want to, you know, people who are not super into literary scenes or sort of artistic scenes, like I don't want to bore them too much with too much technical background. But I guess the underlying idea would be that a lot of what we consider writing and art and literature has become sort of fossilized in the 20th century, and even earlier in a way. And you know, it started becoming very stratified and commodified and sort of in the mid, I would even say the mid 20th century. And I think one way to look at this is like do you personally like read much fiction?
I used to. These days, I mean, honestly, I read quite a lot, but it's mostly I read a lot of occult, esoteric books. I read a lot of biographies. I read a lot of like
Right.
different
And
themes of psychology. But I used to read.
right. And
I'm trying to get back into it. I'm trying to get back into
yeah, and
more fiction
but
writing.
I think that's really like I really relate to that because I think for a lot of it, like what is the, like why would you read like a modern novel or like a book of short stories or like a
Hmm.
modern poetry or contemporary poetry? I think a lot of it is, it's become so stratified in the sense of being like appealing mostly to a very specific sort of demographic, which um,
Mm.
I think doesn't have much to do with the way most people actually live or like um, what's actually happening. So on the one hand, you have very specific sort of genre fiction, you know, as we would say, like you know, like mysteries, crime, science fiction. So there's sort of the hyper niche sense of that, and then there's this sort of what you would call literary fiction, which is usually rather I guess you would call it like upper middle class, you know, writing school sort of NYC fiction, which also in its own way is equally limited to a very niche demographic of people who are mostly going to certain, you know, writing programs or universities to write this very sort of insular. Uh,
Mm.
so, you know, almost as I said with you know, joining a magical order or getting into the occult, like I would say, well, if you're not reading much fiction, well, like why should you? Like why would you? And I think that's a very good question. And I usually start with that in mind as well. And I do think most fiction is very outdated, is very boring, um, doesn't actually grapple with the way most people are perceiving reality now. So that's
Sure.
that's sort of one of the main concepts behind neo-decadence, and most of that situation use the term neo-passeism to describe it, which is
Mhm.
sort of this zeitgeist, or this sort of starting situation of hyper commodified sort of niches of creative work, you know, whether that's something like, you know, Marvel movies, or whether that's you know, the art world, which, you know, is also hyper targeted at only itself in a lot of ways, right? um,
Mm.
so a lot of what we're hoping to accomplish is not really starting from first principles, but definitely like really critically examining and hopefully like reformulating even very basic areas of concern, like what should poetry be now, what should, you know, fiction be now, what should fashion be now, what should art be now, and
Mm.
how do these areas sort of overlap and intersect, and occultism and esoteric practice is definitely one of them. And there actually is a Neo-decadent manifesto of occultism, which is written by Damian Murphy, who I think I mentioned earlier, and
Mhm.
and that's coming out in a collection that I edited called Neo-decadence 12 Manifestos, which is being released in about 3 weeks, I think, from now.
Okay. Will these be on like Kindle, Amazon, or also
Yep,
or just
that's
print as well?
yeah. It's initially coming out as just a physical book, a paperback book, but
Mhm.
I do want to get it available on Kindle and Amazon and everything as an ebook as well, as quickly as possible.
Mhm.
Hopefully, reach as many as people as possible. So what this book is,
That's a good question. As a writer, are ebooks blasphemous from
I
a neo-decadent perspective?
I well, they're real, so they kind of can't be. I don't I have very complicated thoughts because my own personal practice is always my ambition is always to produce a physical object. So I always conceive of books as being, and maybe that's just the way I look at language, in the sense of being like it's something that physically exists. So I always I always aim to come out with a physical book, a physical object. But I do read ebooks, you know, pretty much constantly, and I definitely want all of my own books to be available as ebooks. You know, so whichever way people, and you know, even something like audiobooks, which I personally don't really fuck with that much. I mean, I know, I don't know. Are you into ebooks, or sorry, audiobooks, or
Um, I prefer real physical books. That's like number one for me
right,
for
right, right,
sure,
right,
right? But honestly, I think most books I read are actually Kindle ebooks.
right,
And then after that, for me, ordering a physical book is like a special treat because
right, 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 right,
I know in Japan you guys have Amazon Japan, but
right.
we don't have that at all in Korea, so it
Yeah,
takes
yeah, yeah,
forever to ship it over. It's expensive. But there's certain books you just need to touch and feel, and
yeah,
they're like far worth having in your library, right? But as far as
yeah, yeah.
you're talking about Audible, right? Basically, like audiobooks. I actually do have Audible. I have a subscription, and I only get certain kind of books on Audible that I feel are almost like I feel like a lot of books are inappropriate for Audible.
Right,
Because I need to when I read a book, I like to dig into it and read and think about it and perhaps even highlight, depending on what kind of book it is, right? But
right,
there's other books that are like more like like podcasts almost. If that
Right,
makes
right,
sense.
right, right.
There's certain kind of books that are almost more appropriate for audio, in my opinion. You know, certain
Right. I think
ones I've heard,
another
but mhm,
yeah,
mhm.
another consideration is that my own books are often I often kind of like experiment with typography and like the way things are sometimes laid out on the page. So um
Right, it'd be completely inappropriate for an audiobook. Yeah.
yeah, it yeah, well, audiobook, yeah. Um even like I think now it's not so much a problem, but when the e-readers and ebooks and Kindles first came out,
Mhm.
it's like you just couldn't like even do non-standard like text layouts or like formatting or like, you know,
Mm,
creations that I'm sure a lot of people just wouldn't even have. Like, you know, like what if I want to have two separate text columns on one page or something, or like what if I want to have like one text column going sideways or something. Like again,
yeah.
um, I guess like most people just wouldn't even consider this as being necessary, or like wouldn't even have that as an issue. But
Mm,
at the time I was, and I think the book of mine that you got, like the one you got is Welcome to the Arms Race. Is that?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So especially with that one, there's some of the stories in that are very like, you know, there's stories where things have like different font sizes and different fonts, and like things are laid out in kind of unusual ways. So my original concern was just like, well, can I even like do this on Kindle? Because like if I can't, then it kind of like fucks the story, at least the way I want it to be experienced. Um,
Mm,
but I don't have any like, provided that that's like an option. Like I don't have anything against e-readers or ebooks or and like personally I don't really like fetishize books either. And like I wouldn't even, you know,
uh-huh.
like I wouldn't even consider myself like a book collector or something. I mean, I know some writers and a lot of people I know are very like, you know, they have very complex organized libraries and they like super fetishize the physical book. And like I just, even my own books, I just kind of I wear them out. I just treat them like, you know, I throw them everywhere. I don't particularly organize them, but I really engage
Mhm.
with the physical books. But I don't feel any problem with like, once if I've read something I don't think I'm gonna read it again, like I don't even feel bad just like throwing it away or throwing it out or
Right,
I think,
right, right.
I don't think books should be like, physical books should be like unduly fetishized, but
Mm,
I do think like I do like producing physical objects.
sure, sure.
Answers that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, so most of your books are you offer both formats, is that right? Like
Yeah,
uh, uh-huh.
to the extent that I'm able to, and to the extent that the publisher will do that,
Mhm.
prefer to have my books in both hard copies and ebooks if I'm able to.
Okay. What are some themes that you explore in your own writing? Like you know, you've released quite a few books by now, and you mentioned that you're like editing other ones, writing some new ones too. But what are some like? I mean, are they all completely different, or are there some like underlying themes in your writing? Would you
Yeah,
say?
yeah. It's always like I think the simple answer is they in practice they are all pretty completely different, which is
Mm,
it's kind of a difficult thing to explain because you know, like there's always this question like, well, like what are they about, or what is it about? And
mhm.
a lot of time it's it can be difficult to sort of to give a clear answer to that. Um, but I like to, like, I guess you could classify it very broadly as experimental fiction, which again is sort of a pretty empty term, but
Mm.
I think it would be, I think it does apply in the sense that I usually proceed from being concerned with structure and language more than necessarily just like telling an exciting story or something. And I don't really
Mm.
I'm not really coming so much from the perspective of what, like, is this going to be a, fast-paced mental movie that, people can execute by reading this book. So I guess my perspective is more sort of like poetry. I mean, I would I also write a lot of, and also publish poetry a lot. So I don't think there's such a separation, but
Mhm.
when you're getting into sort of narrative ends. But in practice, what does that look like? Well, um, I do write a lot of sort of uh, science fictional works. I also write realist. Well, I don't know what you would call realist, but more sort of everyday reality sort of things. A lot of which are set in Japan, um,
Hmm.
and there's some more just pretty out there sort of purely linguistic or almost like poetic sort of works or sort of books that I'm putting out. So yeah, it's pretty all over the place, and I'm always hesitant to like repeat myself. Like I think the goal always is to like not repeat as much as as possible.
Right, right. Or like some authors, like it's almost like if you read one of their books, you read them all, where I think your approach sounds ideal or at least unique in that like each one is totally different and um it's like you're giving birth to a different child or something
Yeah,
like that,
yeah,
right?
and
Yeah.
I also like don't really. I'm also like one of those writers or creators where
Mhm.
I get bored very easily. Like even with my own things, like once I finish something, I really like to just sort of immediately move on to the next thing rather than, you know, sometimes even at the expense of like promoting it. Like there's some people and writers who will like release something and then just entirely spend like the next year just spamming it everywhere, right? I very quickly just like kind of just drop it and then what am I going to make next or what am I going to create next and so yeah, I like to keep it like to the extent that I'm able to. I like to keep every book entirely different, or
Mhm.
keep the style different, keep the stylistic approach different. Uh,
Yeah, it seems like I mean, I'm not necessarily a writer. I've written some stuff, but it seems like a lot of writers will find maybe they'll have a successful book or something like that, and then it'll be like, oh, that's the formula, that's the ticket, that's the one that sells
right,
well,
right, and
and then it's like just mimic that. Like, what can I do best to like mimic that formula for
right,
the next one or something? That's the vibe I get, at least.
right,
I don't
and
know if you
I think a big part of like neo-decadence, at least for me, is being like how can I like commit commercial suicide consistently, right?
have. Right.
So how can I so I've never really had any like illusions in the sense of wanting to like support myself with my writing because I think once you I think even like in an occult sense where you're maybe looking at like if you're looking at your kind of Malkuth base of sustaining yourself or living in the world, I'd like to have that set aside and you know take care of that first, and then I can sort of do things which I consider important. And
Mhm.
I don't really have like any what I would consider like commercial considerations. And like if I like when I was in my early 20s, like I like just to see if I could do it, I wrote some short stories, and I was like, well, I wonder if I can like get into these magazines and get paid for it, right? And
Mhm.
I think it was something like actually was it Stephen King said, where he said like if you can write a story, send it to a magazine, collect a check from the magazine, and then pay the electric bill with the check, then I consider you talented. So I was like, all right, well, like I'm gonna try to do that, and I did, right, and I got things accepted, and I collected checks and paid some bills. Um, and then I very quickly got bored with that, and I thought, well, okay, now that I know I can do this, like I can kind of get back to more, important considerations, or um, exploring what I actually want to explore, rather than being like, how can I appeal to people who, in most cases, I probably don't really care that much about, right? So,
Right. It's sort of giving birth to your own creations and doing
right,
your
right,
own
right.
thing.
So
And
I always let that,
whoever's
I
going to
always
be
let
magnetize it, it's going to find it, kind of thing.
right, right. And I always think, well, if if someone is meant to be reading this or engaging with this, then they probably actually will. So I don't feel like the role of the audience is like, is something I ever like really consider consider that much. I mean, it might sound kind of strange, but um, I sort of, I guess, maybe even like arrogantly take it for granted that there will be some audience, but I'm not
Hmm.
thinking like, oh, how much of a check can I collect from this, or like how many are people going to like it? Like I never really
Oh, that makes sense, because like even in doing this podcast, it's not like I'm not thinking like, oh, what kind of sick sponsors am I gonna get, and how can I get enough viewers so I can monetize it? Like, I mean, maybe someday if there's tons of viewers, obviously you can get at what's that called? Like on YouTube they give you like the ad clicks or whatever the fuck it's called. But my main thing is just enjoying it and then asking questions I'm interested in and having conversations and topics
right,
I'm
right,
interested
right,
in.
right.
It's not like I'm doing this to achieve some commercial success so I can be the next whatever mega podcast or whatever, right? So
Yeah, 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 yeah.
yeah, there's
I
like
guess
definitely
there's
like yeah, in
yeah, I guess
podcasting
there's
or writing or anything, right? There's a the commercial approach versus like doing what you're gonna do anyways, and people are gonna you know latch
right,
on or not. Right? People who are interested will definitely
right. And
be attracted.
I don't like I think it's easy to I think it's easy to like take pot shots at people who take the super commercial approach, and like I think it's easy to do because, well, it's tempting because it is easy to take pot shots at them, and it's very like, it is
Mhm.
weirdly satisfying in a way, because it's like you can see these people who are like, okay, I'm gonna take the I don't know what you would call it, like so and so master class, and then I'm gonna learn how to do things the acceptable way, and I'm gonna learn how to get the correct writing techniques for crafting, blah blah blah, right? And I think like I think it's maybe similar with the occultism, where it's kind of like that shouldn't even, like, I personally am not interested in anyone where that's their mindset or their approach, because uh,
Mhm.
you move from you move from having an exploratory approach to having a by the books or by the numbers approach, which
Right.
is exactly the point where interest kind of dies, at least for me, right? So
Right.
I like people who are writers who are too glib with you know um describing things as like it's a fast-paced psychological thriller with undertones of Tom Clancy or something. I mean, I'm like, come on,
Mm,
fucking, like, I don't want to
mm,
I don't want to fuck with this or read it, or like, if that's really how you're approaching it, right? But
mm.
everyone's different, and I don't want to shit on those people too much.
Yeah, that's my mindset too. It's like I can't really hate anyone for making money too. Like,
Yeah, I'm not gonna. I don't
uh,
want to like shit on them, or take pot
yeah, yeah,
too much.
exactly.
Is tempting
Yeah,
as it may be, right?
yeah, for sure.
Um,
Um,
but
how about?
I guess to kind of tie things together. I think like I think one of the, again, like, aims of neo-decadence, or what I see as being uh what should be one of the goals of fiction in the future, is to kind of like decisively break with what I would consider like the kind of unquestioned materialist framework that is usually I guess what most like quotation marks like serious writers would be coming from usually is a pretty unquestioned kind of materialist basis. And I think a cult influenced or like a cult infused or esoteric perspective fiction um, until now hasn't been super great or super common. And I think a lot of reasons for that. And again, I don't want to knock it completely. And there's obviously a lot of writers like Arthur Machen or um, even I mean Gustav Meyrink or there have been fairly serious writers who are also fairly serious occultists and practitioners, or even Yeats, obviously the poet was GD, Golden Dawn,
Right.
GDOG, or I don't know what you would call it. But he was, and he was in his own, I guess, order of, was it Celtic Mysteries or something too?
Oh yeah, right.
So,
mhm.
but I think the standard, or at least mainstream approach, is very much like, he was able to succeed in spite of his, absurd, occult beliefs, or like amazingly, Yeats was able to produce, quality poetry despite being an occultist or something, right? So,
Right.
at least in mainstream circles, I mean, it's very condescending sort of approach, and there's always an attempt to sort of divorce these writers or divorce these artists from their own practice.
Hmm.
And I think until very recently, and like even now, sort of like the idea that these creators or these artists, esoteric practices were actually what produced most of their best work, or were essential to producing their best work, has been sort of almost like a taboo idea, because
Mhm.
if you admit that idea, then you would have to sort of admit that maybe current occultists or current practitioners would be able to find equally valid approaches to producing serious work, and I think that does
Mhm.
sort of, chafe against a lot of the unquestioned assumptions. So
Mhm.
Neo-decadence, I think I think we're very upfront. Damien is very upfront. Like he's just like his fiction is just pure occultism from beginning to end. It's pure ritual fiction, but he's coming in from influences like Robbe-Grillet, or Nabokov, or Gene Wolfe, or a lot of these writers. So he is taking it very seriously and executing it in a very complex sort of technical way. But at the same time, it's pure. His background is just pure occultism, GD kind of background. And even for myself,
Mhm.
I would even when I'm writing something I would consider a fairly realistic story, set in sort of everyday life. I try to always keep that keep that perspective at the back of my mind too, so I don't which again is something I don't usually think is done much. I think even when I think there's sort of a stereotype when occultists try to write fiction, they kind of like default to horror. Do you know what I mean?
Okay. Yeah. I understand what
Um,
you mean.
and I think even Crowley is kind of guilty of this, and I think even like Crowley or like Machen are sort of like guilty of this to an extent, where they're
Mhm.
if you ask someone like what is like occult fiction and horror fiction as being completely separate things, is something that I think people kind of have trouble with.
Sure.
What I mean, so they're like, well, what would it? They're like, oh, it's not some kind of weird fiction or horror fiction. Like, well, what is it then? And I think that's the area which increasingly I'm interested in, and I think Damien and some of these other writers who are pioneering this kind of territory.
Hmm.
I think that's what they're sort of pushing into, is a realm in which that occult kind of infused fiction can exist and can kind of stand on its own, even
Hmm.
addressing things which might be very, everyday kind of ostensibly everyday kind of matters or subject matter.
Right. It kind of reminds me of like when you think of like occult themes or symbols in rock, it's always like heavy metal with a Baphomet, like that's the thing that comes to mind. Like it's kind of like with the writing too, like some sort of
Right,
lore,
right, right, and
right? Where it's almost like a caricature of itself, where you
right,
can,
and I
yeah.
think again, like I never want to like entirely like take pot shots at anyone's perspective or like shit on anyone,
Hmm.
because
Hmm.
everyone finds their own way to things. Uh,
Sure.
but I do think like with occultism, like I notice like a lot of people are coming from um it's interesting, like a lot of people are coming from martial arts backgrounds. Um
Hmm.
a lot of people are coming from like, I guess, like even like role playing backgrounds, right?
Hmm. Apparently, like video games and stuff like that.
Yeah, and like a lot of
Yeah.
these things are things that like I personally like never had any interest in. Uh,
Uh-huh.
so it's interesting to see how people arrive at certain places, often by completely different paths, right? Um, but
Right. I've heard
yeah,
of
I think
yeah, I heard I don't know, there's a show called like Supernatural. I've never seen it. I think it's called Supernatural, but apparently there's like Enochian language in that show, and that's how some people have found out about
yeah,
like
it's
they
hilarious. Like some of
it's
the
actually quite hilarious. I've never seen this show, but it's like I don't know, I just imagine it being like some Sabrina the Teenage Witch kind of
right,
program like this, but yeah,
right, and
I mean,
even
what other way it takes, you know? I mean,
yeah, I think
everyone
even
finds
the
something
more
new.
like, Ozzy Osbourne sort of version of Crowley or whatever. Um,
Right.
I don't want to. I'm hesitant to say that like it's not valid or like it's not. It can't be of use, but I think there. I do think even quite deep into occultism, I think a lot of people do still maintain the perspectives of, the route or the path they took to get there.
Hmm.
Even something very simple is like, what are people dressing like? Like, is
Mm.
are we are people wearing black all the time? Because like I don't want to do that. Like I'm not gonna fucking dress like a goth or something. I don't want to right? Um
Right.
so I think I think there's a lot of these weird sort of assumptions, or like, I don't want to really want to. I mean, like I enjoy, horror films and horror fiction, but I personally don't really want to write it, or I don't even really read that much of it, recently especially. So
Mhm.
I think, creating this sort of different or kind of like more flexible or more maybe like modern take on what occult fiction or occult art, or again even fashion might be like now, and coming up with that is what is kind of a big part of neo-decadence, and um,
Mhm.
it's still just really getting started. I mean, I think you're in the group there too, right? Or
Yeah, yeah, yeah. In the Facebook group, so
yeah, so you're
people can
probably, I mean,
find
that
people can find the Facebook group by just searching for Neo-Decadence, right? Is
yeah,
that
yeah,
how
it should pop up, and if you just Google,
Mhm.
I mean, there's already I'd say that it's, from my perspective, it's still just getting started, but we already,
Uh-huh.
there's already a good, 30 books at least that I would say are very, very neo-decadent. Whether that's the anthologies with everyone, or that's the writers' individual books. Whether that's Brendan Connell's books, or Damian Murphy's books, or my books, or so there's already enough material to keep people going for a while. But I still think it is just getting started in some ways. So I'm pretty excited to see like what paths it will take and how it will develop from now. Because I mean, come on, I always wanted to create an art movement because just like who that, right? No one seems to be very ambitious in this century. You know what I mean?
Sure, sure. They're staying to they are, like you said, they're following certain niches, like, I'm just going to be a science fiction guy, or they're falling within certain lines rather than creating a new line, a new box, right? So
right. And
yeah, I like the idea of it too. I also like the idea of like these other authors you're mentioning that have like occult themes in their books, because there's certainly a resurgence of like the current and like different people publishing books or putting out courses on these topics, but I haven't really seen that much of a literary or like a literature side of it. So, and as you mentioned,
and that's sort of
kind of done before, but not,
yeah,
not
that's why
really in ways. So,
I think that's why it does interest me so much, because creating kind of occult literature, occult fiction, or occult art that isn't genre material, that isn't horror, or isn't mystery or whatever. And I think that's part of the big interest for me. And yeah, like I said, I mean, if you read about the surrealists or the futurists or a lot of these movements, but that was more than 100 years ago. So who's doing that now? So I think it sort of becomes, well, why don't we just do it then? Why don't we just create it and then see where it goes? And it's already very international. I mean, there's a faction down in Brazil that is
cool.
That is putting out books in in Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese, and they're translating all of our stuff, and they're trying to translate their own material into English. And there's people in there's a fantastic writer called Gaurav Monga who's in India, and there's people all over the globe, really. So it is I think that's maybe is one difference with earlier art movements, which were very which were more provincial. It's like 20 dudes in a cafe in Paris or something.
Right. Yeah. That's kind of what I picture, but this is more like a global thing.
Right. And
backgrounds.
I think that was the 20 the 20 French dudes in a cafe, or the 20 Italian dudes, with their suits or whatever. I think it was certainly appropriate for the time, the early 20th century, but this is the early 21st century.
Right.
Technology has obviously moved on massively since then. So it has to be international. It has to be multilingual. It has to have perspectives from all over the place, because otherwise it would seem kind of ridiculous, if it didn't. So
right.
So that's that's another thing we're really a lot of the recent material has been to have language specific or country specific manifestos where writers and artists are sort of determining what direction it's going to take where they're at. Which again really excites me, because it's more unpredictable, and it's all neo-decadence, but the Brazilian faction is going to be different from maybe the American faction, or the Japanese faction or something. So
right, they have freedom to go their own way and to
right.
lay their own unique cultural perspectives and backgrounds.
Right.
Oh, that's pretty cool. So you mentioned Neo-Decadence on Facebook. Is there like a website for it particularly, or is it just sort of each author has their own?
There's I think the publisher that's most associated with it at the moment is Snuggly Books.
Okay.
So
I like the name.
Yeah, because and even with that, I mean, I think even that, like, we're because people were tossing around names, and these. I think people were coming up with these very serious kind of stereotypical names, and I was like, why don't we just have a very harmless sounding or kind of ridiculous name?
It's a very kawaii type name.
Yeah. So it sort of went in that direction, but Snuggly Book
Right.
releasing primarily translations of classical decadent works. Like a lot of those are translated from new translations from French, Italian, Spanish, even Chinese and some other languages that are being released alongside the completely new neo-decadent material. So the Snuggly Books website would be a good place to look. I do have a blog where I'm posting really in-depth interviews, text interviews with a lot of the writers and artists in question. And
Oh, cool.
in the very near future, there will be, likely kind of a main site with manifestos and lots of content. So yeah, I would just say stay tuned for that.
All right, cool. Yeah, in the show notes on YouTube, I'll link your blog as well as the Facebook group, and then also if somebody wanted to find, and the publisher as well, and if Snuggly Books, if somebody wanted to find your books in particular, I know that some of them are available on Amazon. So, how would someone look up your books on Amazon?
How would someone look them up? Just literally just go to search and type in Justin Isis, and everything should just pop straight up from there.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'll put a link in for that too.
Yeah.
And all right, cool. I think we did a couple hours here, I believe.
Yeah,
right?
it's actually really good timing. I head off pretty shortly, get ready for work, but it's actually almost like perfect timing, I would say.
All right, cool. Yeah. All right, cool. Perfect. This has been really a pleasure and great
Yeah, no,
conversation.
thanks. Thanks so much again. I think I mentioned before we started recording, I did try to like prepare for this by listening to your previous podcasts, and I just got completely sucked into them, and I think already, like, how many is this going to be, like, what, the fifth or the
Yeah, this is the fifth. I think this is the fifth one, but
yeah
yeah, I think you mentioned you listened to the one with Frater RC, right?
yeah, I just got completely absorbed in it, and I couldn't tear myself away. So I think you're already offering just so much value with this in many levels, and I'm definitely gonna like obsessively subscribe and just see who when you have on.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, definitely. It's a pleasure.
I really look forward to seeing where it goes.
Yeah, definitely. All right, cool. I guess we'll sign off for now, and until next time.